Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conversations with the Dean. This is a new video series where I interview members of the School of Medicine community about topics of interest and importance to our school. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Nadine Barrett, Assistant Professor of Family Medicine and Community Health, and Kevin Thomas, Associate Professor of Medicine, about the Moments to Movement Anti-Racism Initiative. There are 4 committees in this initiative, each focused on a different group of stakeholders: staff, faculty, health profession students, and graduate students and postdocs. Each committee has been meeting since last summer and have been working incredibly hard. The committees were charged with making recommendations how we can work together to create a more just, equitable, inclusive, and anti-racist school. I'll be talking to co-leaders of all the committees. Today, we're talking about faculty. So Nadine and Kevin, first of all, thanks for chatting with me today. And most importantly, thank you so much for co-leading the Faculty for Anti-Racism and Equity Committee, or FAIR. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the dozens of colleagues who I know worked with both of you on assessing our current state, but also coming up with recommendations for a path forward. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's start, Nadine, with who you actually engaged in the committee work.
Excellent. Yes, it was really an incredible experience and an incredible process. We have a number of people that were involved in this. We actually started by really focusing on a self-nomination process. Through that process, our faculty were able to apply, and out of that, we received 65 applications. Out of the 65, we actually ended up with 17 members of the committee, and they're so diverse, everywhere from center leaders to medical instructors and everything in between. It's just been absolutely amazing. Also, when we think about diversity, diversity across race and age was most certainly a key part of that as well. And so what really did is lead to a really powerful perspectives, multiple perspectives actually, that we were able to learn from each other with. And so, of course, as we think about all of our experiences and our roles and our responsibilities, who we are, all of that played into a key part of that. And you could just imagine, as we were reading and learning about people's experiences here, the challenges that some felt, and what we read and we heard, it was really a powerful and actually bonding moment for all of us, because we all learned so much, which was critical if we really wanted to make the kind of change that we wanted. So again, just a really powerful group of people who really represented the diversity that we would want from the School of Medicine, and people who really tackled this and took it head on to be able to make the kinds of recommendations that we believe would be transformative for the School of Medicine.
So the good news is you engaged broadly and had lots of diverse views of Duke. I guess the challenge was, Kevin, how did you take all that input and actually come up with recommendations?
Oh, I think it's great, and I really echo many of the sentiments that Nadine just shared. It was really a rich experience throughout the process, and to see how the iterations came about. And you're right, we did have a lot of perspectives, a lot of information. In addition to the engagement that we had with each other, we had multiple inputs that have been gathered over the last 5 to 6 years from an institutional perspective as well. We had qualitative interviews that have been conducted by the Social Sciences Research Institute for faculty across ranks and different domains, and that was an important source of information. We've had exit interviews for people who have unfortunately left the institution, but it's important to garner their perspectives and to learn from that and to be better because of it. We also had information from the Diversity and Engagement Survey that is conducted and initially constructed by the AAMC. So we took all of this information. We also, as committee, went out and interviewed key stakeholders. For example, our subcommittee interviewed individuals who were involved in the APT process, which was very enlightening as well. And so we took all that information and wanted to put together recommendations that were, one, really grounded in looking at the policies and the practices of our institution that are contributing to some of the inequity and systemic disadvantage that exists. And that's important because we really want the recommendations that come forward to be rooted in that and not be tied to individuals, but into the programs and the policies, because that will really lend itself and breed itself for sustainability, transparency, and accountability, things that we think are really important. So we took all that information together and ultimately came up with recommendations that we think will put our institution in a better place so that we can promote health equity, identify the policies that exist that are promoting racist behaviors, and also think about issues around bias and how we can change that as well.
So I'm really glad you took on policies and processes, because I really think of it as redoing the hardwiring that's behind everything that we do. And sometimes that requires really getting pretty deep into our processes, but I really applaud your committee taking that on. So we've seen that there are common themes coming up through the work, both within the school, but also within the university and the health system. So talk to me a little bit about the themes that you saw come up in your committee.
There were so many that came up through our process, but we'd like to take the opportunity to highlight just a few that we think are really critical. I think first and foremost, we understood through the process that we really needed a change in the organizational structure of how we are approaching our work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And so that was really critical because I think that allows us to do several things. Again, to hold ourselves accountable. Two, to again promote transparency and sustainability of these processes. But then maybe most importantly is to enable us to take these recommendations and diffuse them centrally, but also down to the unit level. And so having an infrastructure in place that will allow us to do that, we think is really critically important. I think the next thing that we need to consider and think about is really how are we going to begin to implement these things? And so that's going to be critical as well. And so again, as we think about the things that have risen to priority and importance, a lot of them are rooted in culture and climate, and that's critical to begin to change and to have an environment that we believe is healthy for all. And so to that end, I think a key component that really was diffused across all the different committees really was rooted in this need to have a reporting system that allows us to voice the issues that come up, deal with them, have all the parties that are involved at the table to be able to discuss these in a healthy way, and then again, hold people accountable and put processes in place that will allow for really appropriate restoration, which I think is critical. And so those are some of the important themes that we came about. I'll transition to allowing Nadine to really talk about some of her experiences as it relates to culture and climate as well.
The culture and climate piece was a big one. When we think about transforming a culture that has historically been focused in this white supremacy, racist bias perspective, right? As we know with all other institutions, it's really critical to think about what does transforming our culture into an anti-racist, anti-bias equity space look like? And so we spent a lot of time really getting a sense of what that looks like, first being able to describe it, and then from describing it, being able to start thinking about, well, what should it look like? What does that environment look like? And that really spoke to all areas. So when we think about all the different areas that we focused on within the FAIR committee, no question that culture was both integrated in all of that, but it's also integrated in just about everything that we do within the School of Medicine. So when we think about cultural change, there are two big things when we even just talk about organizational culture change. It was really critical. One is organizational change has to start from the leadership. Dean Cotman, your commitment to this work most certainly speaks to that at the highest level here. And that's a critical component of that, but also the communication that comes from that. So what does our mission sound like? What does our vision sound like? And making sure that all of those are integrated within the context of equity, anti-bias, et cetera. And so we really focus specifically on the communication opportunity. We also then recognize that not only is it just about communication, the leadership, and what messages we have, but also what are people learning? What do we know? And what do we as constituents within the School of Medicine and a body and a part of the family of the School of Medicine, what do we understand when we think about and when we hear about anti-racism, anti-bias? What does a culture change look like? And what culture are we changing? What is the language that we typically use? Education was a critical part of that. And it was really focusing in on not just education that just simply is a one-off, but really a longitudinal plan in which all of us within the School of Medicine can have the foundational elements of understanding the terminology, the language, and also what does it mean when we're talking about interacting with one another. So it's the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, and the systemic aspects of anti-racism, anti-bias, and equity. So we really wanted to ensure that training that comes from the School of Medicine will be longitudinal and at least make sure that we're all at least on that first ground level of understanding what that means. Then when we started to think of groups such as committees, for example, that are making decisions around APT, recruitment and retention, all of that, that there's different layers and different types of training that will speak to specific skill sets that people will need to have in order to be able to operate in these different types of committees. So we kind of made it almost like an iterative, layered process in which people can most certainly, again, everyone's on the same page, foundational training, and then specific trainings around that. Another great example is microaggressions. We use the terms all the time, right? Micro or macroaggressions, but not everybody fully understands what that means. And not many people may not even understand when they may be actually doing a microaggression. And so really thinking about those types of language and training that could be specific around that. And so again, what we really noted is that throughout all of the culture change that we talked about, education is a critical component of that from the School of Medicine, integrating it into the different elements and systems and processes that makes up the School of Medicine is a critical component to that as well.
So I love the idea of having a base of education so we are all on the same page, but then thinking very specifically about what our different roles are,
Yeah.
and then what kinds of training and education might be appropriate. So I know that the next steps in terms of getting your reports, and the reports coming from the committees are just unbelievably substantive. But what is your vision of the next step beyond, particularly in terms of engaging this great group of faculty that participated?
Yeah, I think it's really incredibly important that we have an open dialogue as we move forward. That's something that we set out to do throughout this process. We recently had town halls that were first conducted by our committee, but then some of the other committees as well for other constituent groups are now partaking in similar communication forums. And it's really critical because as we roll these things out, we understand that these are complex problems that we have that have been rooted for many, many years. And that it's going to take time to change these things. And it's only going to change through active involvement by all constituents and participants and communicating these things, I think, in a very positive way so that it's iterative. So we're going to roll things out. We're going to try different things and we're going to be willing to change and adapt as we move on the fly. And so creating these spaces and these opportunities to bring people together, to listen, to discuss, to talk, and to be honest about what they're experiencing, I think will be really critical as we move forward.
So it's basically a work in progress, and we all understand that it doesn't begin and end, but it really sets a pathway that we hold ourselves accountable for progress. So this work is so incredibly important and really has the potential for major impact on the future of our institution. I so appreciate your leadership and the work of everyone on the committees. Thank you both for talking to me today, and thanks to all of you for joining us.